Hi everyone, my name is Federico Tartarini and this video is part 3 on how to deploy a Flask application on Google Cloud Run. In part 1 we saw how to deploy a very simple application using Google Shell Console. So we did everything online from their Cloud Console. In part 2 we develop and deploy a complex Flask application and we release it and publish it on Google Cloud Run. Again we use Google Cloud Shell. In part 3, we are going to use only gcloud console locally on our computer. We are going to develop and deploy the application that you can see now on my screen. Currently, I'm running this application on localhost here on my computer, and you can see that we can interact with this application and we can get the results. We are going to see this application, the source code of this application. We're going to change it and edit it to make it compliant so we can then publish it on Google Cloud Run. We're going to test it locally, both we're going to test the Flask application as well as we're going to test it with the Google Cloud Run service to test it locally. And finally, we're going to deploy with Google Cloud Run. We're going to use PyCharm in this video tutorial. You don't need to use PyCharm. However, I highly recommend you that you either use PyCharm or Visual Studio Code to deploy application on Google Cloud Run because it's much easier, because Google Cloud Run supports two plugins either for VS Code or IntelliJ for development, debugging and deployment of your application. You can also test it locally only using Docker, and we're going to see that how to do that as well. But I think it's much easier if you install the plugin for IntelliJ, and in my case I installed the plugin for PyCharm. Please note that in this video part 3, if you want to follow along with me, you will need also to install two extra things on your computer. The first thing that you need to install on your computer is Google Cloud SDK. So to install Google Cloud SDK is quite simple. I will provide this link here down in the video description. If you are on Windows, you can just open the PowerShell and then you can install Google Cloud SDK by just copying this command here inside the PowerShell here. And I'm not going to do it because I've already Google Cloud SDK installed on my computer. Then you launch the installer, you follow this prompt, and then here at the end, just make sure that all these things are ticked, and then you please press on finish, and then you are done with the installation of Google Cloud SDK. The second thing that you need to install is Docker, so you can just look for Docker install Windows or Docker install Mac, and then you're going to be redirected to this page, which I'm going to put the link in the description. And you can just click here, Docker Desktop for Windows. You're going to install Docker on your computer. So those are the two requirements that are needed for this video tutorial. So let's get started. We are going to first have a look at the Flask application. Again, this video tutorial is not about the Flask application itself. So we're going to have a quick look at it and we're going to see what we need to change in the Flask application in order to make it compliant with Google Cloud Run. Here we have our Flask application, and we have in the side application, we have at the end, if name equal to main, we are going to run our application. It's very important, as we saw in part 2 of our video, that we note down how we are calling our Flask application. In our case, inside here the code, we are defining app equal to the Flask application. That's perfect, because the first file that we need to add, as we did in part 2, is Dockerfile. So inside here, as we did in part 2, we are going to import the Python version that we are going to need to use. We can just simply and paste this code as we did in part 2, because this code does not have to change, and we are going to install our dependencies. This command here and this one here at the end are the two key commands that you have to get it right if you want to deploy your application on Google Cloud Run. So here we are installing the requirements. So let's have a look at the requirements file, which is also another file that is needed to be there in order to deploy your application on Google Cloud Run. If you are a Python developer, I'm already sure that you are familiar with the requirement.txt. This is a file that contains all the requirements that your application needs to run. However, inside here, we don't need gunicorn to work. So our application to work locally does not require gunicorn. However, as I previously explained in my previous video, in part 2, in order to run our application on Google Cloud Run, we need to install also gunicorn. If you don't do that, your application will fail and you will not compile correctly and you will not be able to access it on Google Cloud Run. Then finally, we have this command inside the Dockerfile, and as previously mentioned, I'm not going to explain in detail how to change this part of the file, because you can keep it as it is. You can look at Google official documentation in which they are going to explain how you can change these parameters. However, it's crucial and very important that you are going to change this last part if your entry file in the Flask application has a different name from main.py. So as you can see here, my file, the entry file in my Flask application is called main.py. So this is fine. I can keep it as a main. Then we have semicolon, and this is app. As I previously showed you before, my Flask application is called app, so everything is fine. However, if this file was called something different, for example, energy calc, I would have to say energy calc semicolon app, as I showed you in the previous video when I deploy a version of the CVE thermal comfort tool. Another file that we need to add is dockerignore. Dockerignore is going to ignore some files when we're going to compile our Docker container. But this time is also very important that you create also another file. And this file is called gcloudignore. The gcloudignore file is very important because first we're going to create an image of our container. We're going to upload it on cloud storage using gcloud console, and then we are going to get that image and we are going to deploy it on Google Cloud Run. So it is important that you add this file to avoid wasting space and wasting resources on Google Cloud Storage. You want to add git repository and you want to add gitignore file. And also it's important that you add this last command here, which is going to make sure that we are ignoring all the files that are already in the gitignore file. For instance, inside here, you could also add additional files. And in this example, we're going to add, for instance, the README. Because the README, of course, is not excluded in the gitignore file, because we want to sync it with our GitHub repository. But when we are actually deploying our application on Google Cloud Run, we don't need to have the README file over there. So we can add it here inside the gcloudignore. Then we can just have a look at the other files that we have inside here. We have the gitignore file, which I'm sure you have already added to your project repository, and this is not specific actually for Google Cloud Run. So I'm assuming that you always have a gitignore file, and that was my assumption when I was describing the gcloudignore file. Once we have added these three files, now we are ready for testing our application locally, and we are ready to package our application, test it again locally to make sure that we wrote properly our dockerignore file, and finally deploying it on Google Cloud Run. So let me exit the presentation mode. So now I can have my screen back here, and let's first test our application locally. So how do we test our application locally? To test our application locally, we can just write Python, and then we can say the name of our application, of the main entry file. So in our case is main.py. I'm already running it here locally, but let me actually stop. So here, as you can see, I'm running the application. Let me stop it, and I want to rerun it just to show you the application. So if I refresh this page, of course, now I'm going to get an error. So let me run the application. And PyCharm for these things comes super handy, because as you can see, I just have to click here at the top, and this is going to run my application. Alternatively, I can just simply go here at the bottom and I can click here on this green arrow. So now, as you can see, my application is running locally and everything is fine. So I can interact with my application and I can set a new location and the chart gets updated automatically. Then we can go for this next step. So we can compile our application into a Docker container and we can test it locally. So again, in this case, PyCharm comes super handy because we can do this with just a simple configuration here at the top. You just have to go here, edit configuration at the top. Let me remove this one. We click here on plus and we are going to scroll down or up till cloud console, cloud run, and then we're going to say run locally. So we're going to give a name, we're going to call it energy calc because that's the name of our application. Doesn't matter, this is just a random name, you can call it however you want. Then we have to specify the service name, energy calc, and we're going to say that the builder is a Dockerfile. So we press OK, so everything has been configured. Now we just have to press here on this run energy calc. This is going to run our application locally. In the meantime, let me stop the other application that we are running with Flask. This will ensure that we have done everything properly, because we know that our Flask application is working locally because we just tested here. Of course, now it's no longer working because I just stopped that command. But we want to make sure that we wrote our Dockerfile correctly. So we want to just make sure that Google Cloud SDK is able to compile all our files, compile our Docker container, and is going to be able to deploy it. So rather than deploying it straight away to Google Cloud Run and having a bit of trial and test error, we just want to make sure that is working properly. So that's why we are running it locally. Then we are ready to go ahead for the next step. Upload it on here. So we're going to upload it here on Google Cloud Storage, and then we're going to deploy this container to Google Cloud Run. As you can see, this command is taking just a little bit of time, so I will fast forward this section. Fantastic. As you can see, we get a message here at the bottom saying services are now available via local URL. So here we just have to open this local URL. Just be careful that if you click here, it's not going to work because it says that the host is 000. But instead, in our case, since you're using it here on Windows, we just have to copy the second string. So it's going to be on 127.0.0.1 port 8080 as we have specified. Fantastic. So now we can see that we are running it from inside. So we have compiled the Docker container, we build it, and we make sure that everything is working. So now we are almost ready to go. So there is only one step that we need to do, is to deploy our application on Google Cloud Run. So as I previously mentioned, we're going to do two steps. First, we're going to build a container, send it to cloud storage, and then we are going to create a new service inside this project, and we're going to deploy our application. So let's go step by step, and we can just do both commands. So the first thing that we need to do is to build our container and send it to Google Cloud Storage. So I'm entering presenter mode again, so it's going to be easier to follow along and to see. So let me just open my README file and let me open the terminal here. So let me just clear the terminal. Okay, fantastic. So in order to build our container and deploy it to cloud storage, we just need to provide this command, but we need to change a couple of things, and these changes are going to be based specifically on your project. Okay, so I'm going to put this command down below, so don't worry too much, just follow along with me, and I will explain everything as we go. So the first thing that we need to do is to go online here and check the ID of our project. So as you can see, our project is called testbed, but the ID of our project is testbed-310521. So we just have to copy this one and go back here. So we are going to say gcloud builds submit dash dash tag grc.io, and then inside here we need to put the name of our project, and here we just have to say how we're going to want to call this, how we want to tag it. So in this case, the name of the tag that we want to give is energy calc, because that's the name of our tool. And then we're going to say dash dash project, and then we're going to say again the name of the project, because I'm working with different projects on my computer and the gcloud is not set to the right project. So we're just going to press enter. This is going to build and is going to send it to cloud storage. Again, it's going to take like a minute, so I'm going to fast forward this, and we can actually see here on the side that this file should appear here. Great, was success. As you can see, we got the message, and if we refresh this page here, we can now see the new file that we have actually uploaded here. So now, as you can see, there are four different files, and before there was just two. Okay, so everything worked fine. The next step that we need to do is to run this command here. So now that we have uploaded, we just have to deploy on Cloud Run. And then inside here, we're going to change the project name again. Great, so we do gcloud run deploy, the image that we just have uploaded. So we just put the string of the location of the image, and then we say platform manage, and we say project, we say testbed 310521. Great, so now we are ready to go, and we can just press enter. And again, this is going to take a little bit of time and is going to ask us some questions. So it's going to ask us for the service name. We're happy with Energy Calc because that's the name of our tool. So we press run, yes. And then it says that run Google API is not enabled on this project. Would you like to enable it and retry? And then we press yes. You might also, if this is the first time that you do it, Google might also ask you to log in with your Google credential. So it's going to send you like a message, and you're going to have O2 authentication, and you just have to put your password, and you just have to log in with Google via your browser, and then you can just go back here into this series of commands. We also need to specify where we want to deploy this application. In our example, we're going to use US Central, so we just have to type the number next to the location that we want to deploy, so 19 for US Central. Of course, deploy it in the location which is closer to where most of your users are going to be. So I just put 19. And of course, this is very important. As we saw in part 2, we need to allow unauthenticated invocation to Energy Calc. If we say no, then no one will be able to access our web application, which is definitely not what we want. So here we have to say yes. And then now is deploying new service, creating revision, routing traffic, and setting IAMS policies. So again, this is going to take a little bit of time, but very soon we're going to be able to see that our service has been deployed. So if we go here in services, as you can see right now, there is nothing because we haven't yet created any project, or we haven't yet created any service. But soon we're going to see a new service called Energy Calc, and then we're going to be able to access that via a URL. Fantastic. So now we can see that our service called Energy Calc has been deployed and is serving 100% of the traffic, and we have the service URL. So if we click here on service URL, we're actually going to be able to have a URL, a public URL, that we can use to access our tool. So the first time we open this URL, it's going to take a little bit of time, But now we have our tool, which is functional, and is public, is online. So everyone can actually use our tool. Great. The last thing that I want to show you, because I mentioned it before, I want to show you how you can test your application locally if you don't want to use PyCharm and the Cloud Run plugin. So let me just exit the presentation mode here. We can also test it locally that everything is working, and we should be able to do it with this command here. So in this command here, we're just going to have to go into the terminal. So let me go into the terminal here. Let me copy this command here, but there is something that we need to change. Okay. So what we are going to do specifically, we are going to test on port 8080, and on port 8080 we are going to run also this command, which is docker run, and then 9090 port. So don't worry too much about this part here because it's just default. But what we need to change is actually the image URL. And the image URL is the same image that we use and we built and deployed and we uploaded here on Google Cloud Storage. So this is the same information that we put here in the previous command. Of course, now my project ID has changed for this YouTube example. So again, I need to go here, testpad, and I just have to copy this project ID. So let me actually do that. And another thing that I need to do is to have Docker running on my desktop. So let me cancel this because I don't want this confusing. So now I don't have any container. So let me just run this command. Okay, it's not working. So this command is not working inside here because we are using PowerShell. So let me see if I can use a git bash because it's using like a Linux terminal. So I need to go into my project. So cd desktop, GitHub project, energy calc. So now I'm inside. So let me see if I can just simply copy and paste this command here. Okay, so I just copied this incorrectly. Great, is downloading this image, is going to build it, and then we are going to be able to test it locally. So in order to not make any mess, let me just stop here because I was previously testing it locally. So inside PyCharm, so we don't want to have the same application running on the same port and the same local host. So we just have to stop that. So make sure that you do that. But in fact, I'm sure you're not going to use both options. If you are using PyCharm, I'm sure you're going to use just simply PyCharm. But let's see what happens here. Technically, we should be able to test our application locally as we did before with PyCharm. Fantastic, so everything works. So we just have to go inside here in Docker, and then we just have to click here in browser, open in browser. So we can click here, open in browser, and then we are going just to be able to open it in browser, and now we can test that everything is working. So this is another alternative way of testing using Docker, that our application is actually working and everything is fine. I think, however, at least in my personal opinion, I think the previous option of using PyCharm is way better. I really hope you found this video informative and useful. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comment section below, and I will try to answer them as soon as possible. See you next time, and thank you very much for listening.